Hello, and welcome back to another reading update. I have a lot of great books to share with you from the past 2 weeks. I will try to timestamp this video so that you can jump around and see reviews just for the books that you want, but I'm so glad you're here, hopefully enjoying a nice cozy evening with me. First and foremost, I have to mention I finished the 5th season, which was the Elsewhere Book Club pick for June. I was reading this book for the second time, and I enjoyed it a lot more the second time around, actually, because the first time I was mostly just really confused. I had to let it all wash over me, keep going, read the whole trilogy, and now, returning to the first book, I feel like I can truly appreciate what Jemisin was doing and how all of the pieces that she's putting in place in this book eventually come to fit together later in the series. So, highly recommend this one, even if you tried it and you weren't sure, or maybe you read the first book and not the others in the series. I found in my experience that the series as a whole really has grown on me the farther I've gotten into it and the more time I've spent with it. I also read A House with Good Bones by Kingfisher, one of my very favorite horror writers. This is a haunted house story. It takes place in the South, and the fun in this book is that it is not really scary so much as incredibly snarky. The main character is an archaeoentomologist. She studies bugs, but antique bugs, like fossilized bugs, and she is not afraid to let you know of what she thinks of every single bug that appears in this book, and it is a blast. So the premise of this one is that the main character, Sam, ends up having to return to her childhood home because she's temporarily out of work. Her mom lives there, her grandma used to live there before she died, but what kind of freaks Sam out is that it seems like her dead grandma's presence is still oppressively hanging over the whole house, and there's some weird stuff going on. Kingfisher is kind of using the apparatus of horror and the apparatus of haunted house stories in particular to talk about Southern hospitalities and stifling family norms and just that feeling of always having to put on a perfect outside shiny white appearance. Fledgeling is a book from my childhood that I loved. It was kind of a formative influence, and I reread it because of a library challenge that asked me to reread a book from my childhood. So I settled on The Fledgeling, which was published in around the 80s. It won the Newbery honor, and returning to it, I could totally see why it did. We follow Georgie, the youngest kid in a blended family who is convinced that she can fly. She thinks that maybe if she tries hard enough, she can jump down the giant staircase in her house's front entryway and float down instead of falling. It doesn't work very well, except then one day a goose prince, who's this elderly goose, he shows up and he teaches her how to fly. But of course, some of Georgie's neighbors are very skeptical of this large goose that's hanging around all of the time, and hunting season is approaching. And what I really like about The Fledgeling is that it's actually very inspired by the works of Henry David Thoreau. This book was my introduction to Thoreau as a small child. The main character's stepdad father figure is actually a Thoreau scholar, and one of the things that the book drives home again and again is that Georgie is at one with nature. She is all eyes. She practically disappears and becomes nothing but her senses that she uses to observe the natural world around her. And I'm just so impressed with the amount of characterization and the amount of ideas that the author can pack into such a tiny book. A book that did not work as well for me is An Elderly Lady Must Not Be Crossed. I got this one for free from a book event at my library. It was fun. It was this adult library night. There was jazz, there were root beer floats, there were free books. So I grabbed this cute little book, which is translated from Swedish, and basically it follows an elderly lady who is a kind of unintentional serial killer. She plots the deaths of those who cross her, and those who cross her are usually appropriately bad scumbags. Evidently, though, this is actually the second book in a series, and I don't know if that tainted my enjoyment a little. Each chapter is kind of its own standalone story, so I thought it would be fine, but many of the stories in this installment follow not the elderly lady doing her serial killing, but just her backstory. And that's also cool, but at the same time, the backstory also involved a lot of murdering, and I came to the conclusion that as a child, the main character was just not very nice. She just wasn't a good person. Sometimes it can be fun to read books from the perspectives of people who are not very nice, but in this case, it kind of just tainted my enjoyment. And last but not least, because she could never be least, I read The Language of the Night by Ursula Le Guin. This is a new edition of a collection of her essays on science fiction, fantasy, and their place in the world. Le Guin is an incredible prose stylist, and that remains true for her nonfiction as well as her fiction. She writes with wit. She writes in a surprisingly casual style in her nonfiction, which I really enjoyed. You can kind of hear her giving lectures from the pulpit. Like, there are sometimes when you can just imagine like an Henri student asking a question and she's like, "Well, allow me to elaborate." And many of the essays in this collection concern why science fiction and fantasy can have and ought to have literary merit, and why they should be considered in literature along with literary fiction. Like, we shouldn't have genre fiction closed off in one space and then literary fiction in another space, but really science fiction and fantasy are a way of saying just as true things as literary fiction. Le Guin also talks a lot about Jungian archetypes and how they apply to her work, and I mean, I'm pretty skeptical of the whole Jungian archetype thing, but it's very interesting to see Le Guin analyze her own writing, and in fact, I think that's my favorite part of this collection, is that Le Guin is constantly footnoting her own work. She is constantly reflecting on what she has said, and she's not afraid to say, "Hey, I think I was wrong about X, Y, and Z. I have a new opinion now." That's what's pretty incredible to me, is like Le Guin was so brilliant but so humble. She was always willing to reflect.